5 seconds, that's all it took. One order, one nod, one moment frozen in time. He didn't know it then, standing in the cold morning mist of a war-torn French village, that this single decision would follow him for the rest of his life. Around him, other soldiers moved with purpose, some exhausted, some numb, some just trying to survive another day. But he was the one who had to choose. The officer's voice was calm, almost too calm. The kind of calm that makes your stomach turn because you know what's coming isn't going to be easy. And at WASN, single quotes T, this is not a story about heroism. This is not a story about medals or glory. This is a story about a man who did what he was told to do, and spent the next 50 years wishing he hadn, single quotes T. History moved on. The war ended. The world rebuilt itself. But for him, that morning never ended. It was early 1944. World War II had turned into a grinding, brutal machine that consumed everything in its path. The front lines weren't clean, they weren't simple, and the decisions that had to be made there, those weren't simple either. He was a sergeant, not a general, not a strategist, just a man doing his job in a war he didn't start. His unit had been tasked with securing a small village in northern France, one of many that changed hands between Allied and Axis forces. Like pieces on a chessboard no one wanted to play. The village itself was barely standing. Buildings crumbled. Roads were cratered. Civilians, those who hadn't already fled, moved like ghosts through the rubble, too scared to stay, too exhausted to leave. And then the order came. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy combatants were hiding among the civilian population. Not confirmed, not verified, just suggested. The kind of report that leaves room for doubt, but not enough room to ignore. The officer in charge, a man who had seen too much and felt too little by that point, gathered the unit. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice was steady, methodical, like he was reading from a manual. We've been authorized to conduct a sweep. Anyone who doesn't comply with identification checks is to be detained. If resistance is met, you are authorized to neutralize the threat. Neutralize, that was the word. Clean, professional, detached. But everyone in that room knew what it meant. The sergeant felt his chest tighten. He glanced around at the other soldiers. Some stared at the ground, some nodded, their faces blank. One soldier, younger than the rest, opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. No one questioned it, no one refused, because in war, you don't refuse. You follow orders, you trust the chain of command, you do what you're told, and you hope it's the right thing. But hope doesn't carry the weight of consequence. The sweep began at dawn. The village was silent, except for the crunch of boots on broken stone and the low murmur of voices as soldiers moved door to door. The sergeant led his squad through the eastern quarter, a cluster of half-collapsed homes, where smoke still rose faintly from a fire that had burned days earlier. They knocked, they called out. Most doors didn't open, and then they reached a house at the end of the street. It was small, barely more than a single room with a sagging roof. The door was ajar. The sergeant motioned for his men to stay back, then pushed it open. Inside, it was dark. The smell of damp wood and old smoke filled the air, and in the corner, barely visible in the dim light, was a man. He was older, maybe 50, maybe 60. It was hard to tell. War ages people in ways that don't show on a calendar. His clothes were torn, his face hollow. He didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there, staring at the floor. Identify yourself, the sergeant said, his voice firm but not cruel. The man didn't respond. The sergeant repeated the command, this time louder. Still nothing. One of the soldiers behind him shifted nervously. Sarge, maybe he doesn't speak English. The sergeant knew that. He wasn't stupid. But orders were orders, and the protocol was clear. Failure to identify could be interpreted as resistance. He tried again, this time in broken French. The man's eyes flickered just for a second, but he didn't speak. The sergeant felt his pulse quicken. He didn't want to make this decision. He didn't want to be the one standing in that doorway, holding a rifle, looking at a man who might be innocent, might be dangerous, might be nothing at all. But the clock was ticking. The officer was outside, waiting for a report. The rest of the squad was watching. And then the man moved. It was barely a movement, just a shift of his hand, reaching towards something in the shadows. The sergeant's instincts took over. His training kicked in. His finger tightened on the trigger. One shot. The sound echoed through the village. Sharp and final. Man slumped forward. The sergeant stepped closer. his breath shallow, his hands shaking, and then he saw it. In the man's hand wasn't a weapon, it was a photograph, old, faded, creased at the edges, a family, a woman, 2 children. The sergeant stood there, frozen, staring at the photograph as it slipped from the man's lifeless fingers and fell to the floor. No one said anything, no one moved. And in that silence, something inside the sergeant broke. The official report was clean, concise, professional, enemy combatant, neutralized during identification sweep, no Allied casualties. That was it, typed up, filed away, forgotten by everyone except the man who pulled the trigger. The war continued. The sergeant continued. He fought in more battles, followed more orders, survived when so many others didn't. And when the war finally ended, he went home. But home wasn't home anymore. He tried to move on. He got a job, he got married, he had children, he did all the things people do when they're trying to build a normal life. But normal doesn't come easy when you're carrying weight no one else can see. At night, he dreamed of that village, that house, that man, the photograph. He never told anyone, not his wife, not his friends, not even the veterans he'd drink with on quiet Friday nights, the ones who understood what it was like to come back from a war that never really let you go. Because how do you explain it? How do you tell someone that you followed the rules, did everything you were supposed to do, and still destroyed a life that didn't need to be destroyed? There was no trial, no punishment, no investigation. Legally, he did nothing wrong. Morally, that was a different question, and it was a question that had no answer. 50 years passed. The sergeant now, an old man, sat in a small room in a quiet town far from any battlefield. His hair was grey, his hands were weak, but his memory was sharp. People asked him sometimes, when they found out he'd served in the war, if he had any stories, any heroic moments, any close call. He'd smile politely and say no, nothing worth telling. But that wasn't true. He had a story, he had a moment, he had a decision that shaped every single day of his life after it. First part, he still didn't know if he'd made the right choice. In war, they tell you to trust your training, to follow orders, to do your duty, and he did. He did everything they asked of him. But duty doesn't erase doubt. Orders don't silence guilt. And sometimes, the hardest battles aren't fought on the front lines. They're fought in the quiet moments when you're alone with your thoughts, replaying a decision you can never take back. History remembers the big moments, the turning points, the victories, but it forgets the small ones, the ones that didn't change the war but changed the man. He followed one order, and it destroyed him.